Hi, everyone. Welcome and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar and discussion on rebuilding momentum, addressing drops in Hispanic-Serving Institutions and Latino student enrollment. We're going to get started in just a minute, but before that, I'll just quickly run through some logistics. First of all, the webinar and discussion today is being recorded, and there will be time at the end for questions and answers. Our panelists will be able to address any questions you have. So throughout the discussion, as you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And of course, if you have any other comments that you want to share, please feel free to use the chat as well. And if you experience any technical issues today, please reach out to us through email at research@edexcelencia.org. And if you're interested in following up with anything later on, also email us there at the same place, research@edexcelencia.org. So thank you again for joining us. And with that over, it's an honor to turn it over to Excelencia in Education's CEO and co-founder, Deborah Santiago.
Thank you, Russell. Appreciate that. And I see folks are joining in. So welcome to all of you. We want to be respectful of your time. We have a lot to cover. So why don't we get started just giving you kind of an overview of what we expect to do with our time together, and hopes that it can incite some thinking, maybe some questions or some observations of what you've done. While we're doing that, for those of you that are waiting for us to join, please do share in your chat where you're coming in from. So that we get a sense of who's with us, the good and bad of being virtuals. We can't see you all, but we'd like to get a sense of who's there. We've got a three-pronged approach to our conversation with you today. I want to start by sharing with you some of the latest analysis on Hispanic-serving institutions and the enrollment of Latino students in higher education today, based on some of the latest publicly available data, which is 2020, 2021 data that's out of the US Department of Education, National Center for Education Statistics. So you'll get a good context and of what's happening with HSIs and Latino student enrollment from a data perspective. But we know that data are only part of the story. So we want to complement that by really focusing on the bulk of our time together on institutional efforts and strategies. And we have some esteemed colleagues with us that are going to engage in a conversation with us about those topics overall before we get to you and see if you have some questions that we can address. So for today, as I mentioned, I'm Deborah Santiago. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Excelencia in Education. And with us is Emily Labandera, our senior research analyst here at Excelencia, who helped spearhead a lot of the work we did this year on HSIs and Latino college enrollment with Russell, who you just met. And then we have Elizabeth Bejar, interim provost for Florida International University, and Robert Vela, the president at San Antonio College, and he also serves on Excelencia in Education's board of directors. So that is the group that you're going to be hearing from today, from our perspectives and what we understand about the data. I wanted to take a minute to give you a little bit more context before we run to Emily and get into some of the data overall. Those of you who are on this call know that higher education has seen a really changing landscape. I think it was happening even before the pandemic. But what we've seen in terms of identifying the value of higher education, the ways, the modalities and strategies and intensity of offering a higher education opportunity to students, the changing demographic and efforts that are going on to make sure that we address students of color, communities of color, while serving all students. Have all been conflated in these last couple of years as we think about the role of higher education in our society, our communities, and the institutions that are very intentional in making sure that our communities and students are served well. So Hispanic-serving institutions, which is where we're starting this conversation, what you see in the title, that there's been a drop in the number. At Excelencia, we've been following the understanding and the potential of what HSIs are in this country, because we know that Hispanic-serving institutions are a political construct defined by enrollment. And as we've been listening and learning over the last 18 plus years know that there are institutions that became HSIs because of demography and geography, and there are institutions that are HSIs because of intentionality and impact. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to deconstruct what does serving mean? How do we understand that from the lens of those who are very intentional and focused on students? Because a large part of the work cannot just be enrollment, which is a necessary but not sufficient precursor to serve our students. And thinking about the numbers of institutions, thinking about the drops in enrollment now, the drops in numbers, which we've seen growing for the last 20 years for the first time to drop. There are a lot of implications that we need to think about at the national level, at the policy level, but also about what institutions are doing to address and mitigate those issues and topics. So I share that with you as broad context. We're going to get into that with the data and with our colleagues as we go forward. So why don't I hand it over to you, Emily, to get us started on what it is that we know about HSIs right now to guide our discussion.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Deborah. And thank you all for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to share a bit about our analysis and data and really get into that conversation later. But I first, we want to show you just a quick overview first of our HSI analysis for the year 2020-21. And then we'll get into a bit more and share more in depth about what we're seeing with the drop in the number of HSIs, as well as the declines in Latino student enrollment, which will be more of the bulk of our conversation. So you'll see here that in 2020-21, 559 institutions met the definition of an HSI. And this is relatively a smaller number of institutions that enroll most Latino students. We're seeing that these 559 represent less than 20% of all colleges and universities, and yet they're enrolling over 2/3 or 66% of Latino undergraduates. So a significant concentrated enrollment of Latinos there. We also wanted to provide you a breakdown of the HSIs also by sector. So of the 559 HSIs in 2020-21, almost 70% of them are public. So you'll see here in the chart, 40% are public 2 years and almost 30 are public 4 years, rounding out that set almost 70%. When you look at level by year, almost 60% are 4-year institutions, the public 4 here and the private 4 here. And when we take a look at the geographic focus and this widening reach we see in HSIs over time, in 2020-21, HSIs were located in 29 states, the District of Columbia, and in Puerto Rico. And if you see from the map we're showing you all here, you can see that HSIs are also found in states where one normally wouldn't think of or associate with having large Latino populations. So an interesting point to think about there in the reach of HSIs. So now, taking a step back and thinking about addressing the drops that we're seeing. For the first time in 20 years, we've seen that the number of HSIs has decreased. And here in this graphic on the left that we're showing you, we honed in on just the last 5 years for you all to see. And as you can see, that steady line increasing over time shows that steady growth year to year of HSIs. And then we see that dip from year 2019-20 to this latest year of data, which is 2020-21, also covering that first year of the pandemic. So with looking at these numbers and the data, we saw that reasons for this decrease are a number of factors, right? For one, the decline in Latino undergraduate student enrollment. We also saw, however, that some institutions closed and some institutions also consolidated during this time. So significant, not just the student focus, but also on the institutional side as well. And then you'll see this short equation that we have for you here that we wanted to provide. And you might be thinking, what's this 42-32? Essentially, the 42 represents institutions that were HSIs in the previous year. So in 2019-20, those 42 were not HSIs in this latest year, 2020-21. And the reason being any one of these that I just mentioned, either they had a decline and dropped out of the threshold of being an HSI in their enrollment, or closed or consolidated. But conversely, we see that the number 32 here in this equation represents 32 institutions that were not an HSI in the previous year that crossed the percent threshold of 25% FTE Latino undergraduate enrollment for the latest year, 2020-21. Hence, that drop, that net drop of 10 institutions. So just getting a little bit into the math there for you. But taking a historical look now, not just focusing in on HSIs, but at Latino enrollment over time, we see that Latino enrollment had been growing and had been growing at an accelerated pace over many years. Here in this chart, we go back 50 plus years, but really honing in on that pace in the last 20, we see an acceleration happening until the drop in 2020. And from this graph, the Latino students are represented by this dark blue area that I'm showing you here. And if you'll take a look, right around this year, 2020, was when we see that dip in the accelerated growth and the growth in Latino student enrollment. And another point outside of that historical look is projections data, which you can see here. These data show projections out through the rest of this decade. We continue to see a decline in 2021 for the Latino student enrollment. However, it's in the years later on in the decade that growth kind of continues once more later on, just not at the accelerated rate that we were seeing in the years prior. So thinking about the projected growth and speaking about those projections and addressing, rebuilding this momentum in Latino student enrollment, we want to leave you with this piece of information before we wrap up on our data today about emerging HSIs. And emerging HSIs are another critical group of institutions enrolling Latinos. And Excelencia developed this category a number of years ago. And these represent institutions that have undergraduate FTE Latino enrollment between 15% and 24.9%. And we developed this category to really track the growth in potential of HSIs. And as you can see, tracking this growth over time, we've seen that while there might have been a drop this last year in HSIs, emerging HSIs have continued their growth. And you can see we increased from 362 emerging HSIs the previous year to 393 in this latest year of data. And they also have a wide reach and enroll a significant number of Latino students. So with that, thank you so much for your time today and taking a look at these data and our analysis with us. I want to point you to our website where you can visit for more analysis. This year, we released really interesting interactive dashboards and story maps that you can really dig a little deeper into the data and kind of play around and get a sense for the analysis we've done. And please stay tuned for more analysis that's coming our way. We will be releasing more on Latino student enrollment overall and others through our website and also our social media. But thank you so much. And I'm gonna turn it back to Deborah. Thank you.
Emily, thank you. Also note that we've got some work on Latino college completion and a deeper dive on emerging HSIs, which is an interesting construct. You gave us some really good data and a snapshot. And to your point, there's a lot more to be understood here. I think that the context for this conversation is addressing the drop and what do we do to rebuild the momentum? As Emily was sharing, the enrollment of Hispanic students in higher education had been accelerating significantly. And as we took a deeper dive at those data, saw that while there had been significant growth, over 33% growth in Hispanic enrollment over the last 10 years, that in about 3 to 4 years, we saw a significant drop, like loss in those gains, just with the pandemic and efforts going forward. So that sets the context for this conversation with Robert and with Elizabeth, which is taking a look at what does this mean when we look at this national data and bring it down, because to think about institutional effort and strategy, because while we can look at a national context, ultimately this has to get addressed at a local level. This is on the investments and strategies and efforts of institutions and community leaders and families day in and day out. That's what helps inform and help us to understand. So with that, I'd like to turn to Elizabeth and Robert and ask you to join me as we have a conversation about what we just shared at the national level, but even more importantly, what does it mean as you think about Florida and Texas and FIU specifically and San Antonio College and your leadership and your team and your institution and what you're doing in this space? That's what we're going to turn to. So let me start first with you, Elizabeth, just because I see you immediately to my left, and then we'll go to the right and talk to Robert. So you've seen this drop nationally. First, has FIU seen a drop in your student enrollment? If yes, do you know why? If not, why do you think that hasn't happened? Start with you.
So thank you. Good afternoon. Good morning to those of us on the West Coast, or those of you on the West Coast. I'm Elizabeth Bejar. I want to start by just thanking Excelencia in Education, the board represented here through Robert and his leadership as advisory board members, but most specifically Deborah and Sarita for their vision, right? Clearly, that the data could indicate that Hispanic higher education in the United States may be at an inflection point. And what we do about this, right, both at the national conversation, at the data analytics conversation, and then at the operationalization stage locally, right, through leaders like Robert, myself, and so many of us around the country, is going to be important and may actually define the next trajectory of the 10, 20, or 30 years. So certainly context, hashtag context matters, is important, and not every community has experienced the pandemic the same. We've all experienced the pandemic. Florida, as you know, has certainly seen a growth in population and residents and people flocking to our great state. And FIU has seen a small dip in enrollment, right? So not consistent necessarily with the national amounts, but we are very concerned because when we hone in on the granularity of that data, it is about the 2-year AA transfer rate, of which FIU is a 4-year research university with professional schools, but we are an anchor institution in our community with over 70% enrollment. And so we enroll a majority of our students through that transfer pipeline. And as Emily shared on her slides earlier, that 40% public 2-year institutional mark that serves so many Hispanic students is representative and indicative of a decline in Hispanic enrollment. And certainly the emerging HSI movement, right, may indicate some demographic shifts across communities, but with intentionality, we have to hone in and ensure that our short-term and then long-term ecosystems and pipelines of students are mitigated through our strategies with intentionality.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for pointing that out too, because nationally we have data that show overall 2-year institutions saw the biggest hit of all when you compare by sector and type and control. And I think you also saw in the numbers, the growth in the number of 4-year private HSIs. It's also very interesting to see where those things land. Robert, you are the president of a predominantly 2-year institution in Texas. So tell us a little bit about your experience over this last year or a couple of years in your enrollment. Have you seen a drop in enrollment, and what could you attribute that to if you have?
No, thank you, Deborah. Let me just welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon to some. It's better just to say howdy, y'all, right? And from Texas, I want to thank my colleagues, Elizabeth and Emily, but more importantly, a big shout out to Deborah and Sarita for the advocacy and the leadership and the content experts to keep our eye on the ball and what really matters in higher ed for us as leaders in higher ed. So I can't thank you enough for that, Deborah. But in San Antonio, yes, we saw a slight dip like in Florida. We're seeing tremendous growth in our city of San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio College is, we're located just north of downtown. So we're large, we're urban. We serve 19 to 20,000 students, predominantly from highly minoritized communities, inner city schools kind of thing. I tell you what we saw. We initially, when we were hit with the pandemic, we were able to keep our students with us, meaning we took a very strategic approach to say, hey, for the first time in our careers, we can honestly say we're all in this together. It's not like students are going through something and we have been there and we kind of forgotten what we've been through when we were students. We acknowledged that we were all in it together and that we didn't know what we didn't know. We just knew that we were facing a global pandemic. So we said, guys, just take us by the hand. We're going to walk through this together while we experience something that we've never experienced before. But in the process, let's be sure you have all the tools you need to pivot from face-to-face to remote. Make sure you have the hotspots, the technology. So we were handing out laptops, hotspots. We were doubling down on our monies that we had internally. And then, of course, the big HERF money relief came in to really draw down those technology needs for our students. So what we saw was we didn't see enrollment loss initially until the fall of 2021, right? Is when really for us, we saw about an 8% decrease, which we panicked. But it was simply when we did very, very careful analysis. We did a lot of triangulation, a lot of surveys, a lot of focus groups. And what we saw, students were really thankful about the efforts that we have. They acknowledge that we've done everything that we can do as a college beyond their wildest dreams. They were simply trying to manage loss of life, sickness, long-term effects of COVID, the pressures of a multi-generational family in one household sharing, maybe one piece of technology or these kinds of things. And what we got, Deborah, was just a sense of folks they were hanging on. And it got to where they were just, for us, just tired. They were so tired of trying to hang on and hoping that it would go away, and it went away, and then it came back. That's the different strains. So what we saw was a loss, and we said quickly, let's get them back on so they don't lose track. And right now for the spring semester, we're actually flat in enrollment. So we've been able to recoup some of our students because we've never lost track. And they said, it's funny, right? Because we said this before as colleges and institutions, we have practices, we have policies, we have procedures in place that are designed to keep our students out. I guarantee you, they're designed to keep students out. So guess what happened from our finance folks when those folks weren't returning their laptops and their hotspots? Well, what do we need to do? Do we need to turn them in? Do we need to press chart? What are y'all talking about? No, you use that as a tether to say, you're still with us. We want you to keep that equipment so that you can onboard that next part of term. So if they've got a part of you with them, chances are they're going to come back to you, right? So it's one of these things that we leverage some of the things that we used to penalize our students with as a way to really stay connected with our students so that we didn't lose them, at least for more than 2 parts of term. And I want to emphasize for our Latino students, 67% of our students in Santiago College are Latinos and Latinas. When you grow up from humble beginnings, you're used to getting whatever you can get. Whatever you can get is good enough. And when we as a higher ed institution say, you're going to get excellence from us and everything that we do, it changes their mindset and their value about higher ed, because it's no longer something to get by. It becomes aspirational. It becomes that dream that they've been wanting to fulfill when they were 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. You really tap into that affective domain of their brain that makes a connection of value, of substance, of meaning, of purpose. And I think that was part of what we were trying to do to ensure that and you can't do that, as you know, Santiago, Deborah, as being a major proponent of data, but you got to add accountability. And you've got to be sure that you know who's up, who's down, who's winning, who's losing, and do something about some of that work.
That's right. Data can add context, but this is part of the conversation you're sharing here. And, so much of this is grounded, I know, in we've listened and learned to so much of what you guys have been doing. I think, Elizabeth, you guys were some of the first calls we made, and you shared about the challenges of pivoting quickly and staying relevant with industry and making sure your students had opportunities overall. And that really is grounded in knowing who you're serving and who you're not serving and how to serve them well. So back to you, Elizabeth, and some of the work that FIU has done. So while you haven't seen a significant drop, you have seen some changes. You as an institution have taken some really concerted efforts to make sure that your students know that they belong there and that they're got your support to go to and through. Can you share with us just a little bit more about what you've been doing at FIU?
Certainly, and before COVID, right, before the pandemic, we had a philosophy of we're going to meet the students where they are. So as Robert said, once the pandemic began and we were all in it together, I like the way Robert expressed that. We very quickly pivoted to remote teaching. We had to support our students, our faculty, our staff, and all of their families, because everybody was going through this. But what we did was leverage on the strengths of our community, which is the importance of family, the importance of networking, the importance of communication, clear and crystal communication. So I love that. Really, Robert and I didn't practice, but I love the way he said it. We don't know what we don't know. We did not, as institutional leaders, pretend we have this pandemic under control. We said, no, hold our hands. We're going to get through this together. That's the grit, the resilience, and the determination that is the Hispanic culture and the future of America. So we're certainly embracing that. We recognized, I was, standing on the sidewalk saying, come back to class. We're going to make it as safe as we can, but come back. There's too much learning loss. It's not about online modality, hybrid modality, or face-to-face. Those of us here and those of us listening know that there's a lot of experiential learning. There's a lot of learning in the daily bump and grind. In the academy, we refer to as social capital and networking. And when we're talking about the students that we serve, 50% Pell, 25% first generation, over 70% Hispanic. And they all have passion, they all have commitment, they all have those aspirations, but we have to guide them there. And we did support them. We supported them with the HER funds in our community, service, retail, hospitality impacted, tourism impacted, right? So we wanted to ensure to our students, we're here for you. We put all methods of media out there. I'll tell everybody on this secret what the students were very honest in telling me. Dr. Bejar, we don't read your emails. That's not our generation. But you should know where I am because I'm on Facebook. I'm on social media. Facebook is the older ones, right? I'm on Instagram. I'm on all those tech. And so we had to deploy resources to make sure that our students could feel connected with us. That interconnectedness is really part of our spirit. And so we wanted to do that. When we realized that our students wanted to get back on track and not miss a beat, we said, okay, we'll do weekend study hours, we'll do boot camps, right? So we use some of that funding, that institutional support funding, not only to get them the technological tools, but once we were able to come back and we're back, right? We wanted to make sure that we could engage with them and so that they wouldn't feel 3 to 5 years from now that they hadn't caught up on the year and a half, and that was kind of in suspension. We said, you know what, you wanted a 16-week internship. We'll talk about that next week, but we worked with industry partners and said, let's create sprinternships. Let's do shorter term, 1 week, 2 week experiences. Let's onboard them virtually, put them in face-to-face, bring them back out and leverage those tools and technologies of hybrid to make sure that the students were able to leverage as much opportunities as we needed to. We also wanted to respect the Hispanic ecosystem. So we communicate with families, with loved ones. No one here does this alone, right? I think I'm so blessed that being part of the Hispanic culture that we're open about that. I can't do this. I didn't do this without my mom helping me with my young daughter a decade ago, right? So we're very much forward facing about that transparency, that honesty, and serving with intentionality. So we've worked really hard to be able to do that and to be able to see our students shine through this.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's always impressive to hear the kind of the flexibility and creativity. Often when we talk at the national level, there's so much discourse about how rigid and inflexible higher education is, how students have to adapt to a very traditional old school approach that wasn't created for them, which is true in many ways, right? It wasn't created, especially for our students of color. You just articulated some things that were just showed a great deal of creativity, flexibility, and your point, meeting students where they're at. You also mentioned a little bit about resources, but I'd like to just make sure we touch upon, because they're the resources I think you both mentioned that your institution had, and then there was additional resources that came from the federal government through CARES and HERF, the short acronym terms for federal funding that was provided because of the pandemic. So maybe I'd start with you, Robert, but I'd love to also hear from you, Emily, at what's going on, Elizabeth, with the use of funds. Robert, you talked a little bit about this, about hotspots and others. How did you leverage the CARES and HERF investment that came in from the federal government and to make sure your students were served well?
No, that's a great question. And for us, we need to be sure that we understand the regs to know exactly what we needed to go out, because we are all creative thinkers. We think outside the box, but we want to be very, very careful with that. So yeah, we doubled down on hotspots, handed out, laptops for students that couldn't access their remote classes. We really maximized our parking lots and created these ultra Uber type hotspots so that students that were having trouble logging on and taking tests would not be interrupted, whether they wanted to come to our parking spot or they wanted to come to our campus in the outdoors, right? They could. So that was an infrastructure kind of thing. We also added more ability through our food pantry, our closed closet. We have a telehealth system by which they can get support through a telephone and even through a social work setting to be able to triage the students via the phone line. We partnered with our University of Texas Health School of Nursing to provide a clinic on campus free of charge to students. We had to really double down on all these wraparound services just to get students through, right? And know that we were there for them through these very difficult times. And for us, I got accused of, well, Dr. Vela, as you can imagine, they said, we're not a social service agency. I said, first of all, let me just explain something to you really, really quick. This is a retention effort to ensure that we matriculate every one of our students in our college, right? So it was a retention effort. We know that simply sending students to a resource in the community, chances are they're not going to get there, right? We have to own that. We have to provide that level of service and care to our students. This past semester, we paid for everyone's textbooks. No student paid for textbooks. And that's another major use of our funds to say, I know tuition we've got your tuition, we got it covered. Well, but our textbooks are so expensive. Guess what? We're going to pay for all your textbooks. Guess what? If you have a balance from 2 years ago, we're going to wipe that and make it clean. We're going to give you a fresh start. We wiped out balances. We paid for textbooks. We paid for materials for their clinical sites. We really try to maximize every dollar that we can to ensure that students didn't feel like this was going to be very difficult. Because you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and a lot of our students are at those basic needs or psychological needs. It doesn't take much to get them really disoriented about, and they really quickly go back to what they know best. And it's like, well, school is like a luxury. Let me go back to working, right? I didn't want it to feel separate from that. It needed to be all cohesive. So I remember, Deborah, a student told me she was in our line getting food. We basically say, hey, open your trunk and we'll put a nice box of a lot of different produce and meats and stuff. And I was there helping, and we were loading the trunks, and I noticed this young girl came out and she quickly gave me her back. And I was a little puzzled by that because everybody was like, so I tapped her on the shoulder and I said, sweetie, is everything okay? She was in tears. She was in tears. And I said, what's wrong? Is there something else that we can help you with? She said, Dr. Vell, I'm just so embarrassed because I'm a PTK officer. I've seen you in all these formal events. And now I have to come here and grab food from me and my child, right? I said, sweetie, this is family helping family. This is what family does for family. This is what the Latino culture has been so good at, is that when a family member is in trouble, it's not a handout. It's not a, it's family helping family. I said, don't take it that way, other than we're here to help you. When times are tough, we're here. But we as leaders, and I know Elizabeth talks about this and does it herself by example, we have to set that. We have to be out there. We need to be in the middle of that with parents, with students, explaining to them how important it is, because we've been there ourselves, right? We've been through that ourselves.
Right, absolutely. Thank you. I want to follow up with that, but I want to hear a little bit more about what FIU has done with their CARES and HERF, and then I'm going to go from there because I want to see what's been institutionalized. Elizabeth.
Certainly. So, so as Robert said, two different kinds of funds, institutional funds and student funds. So the funds that we could direct to students, we did, and a lot of it was an educational campaign. So much of around financial literacy and financial wellness, and not in a pre-pandemic textbook kind of way, but all of a sudden, and particularly, right, that is part of the Hispanic culture. Small mom and pop businesses were the first to be impacted.
Right.
They lost their supply chains, they lost their customer base, right? And so, a student's plans, a student's FAFSA completed the year before, 6 months before, changed significantly. And those students didn't have the tacit knowledge, right? The ability to come forward and say, I need a professional judgment reconsideration, right? So we had an educational campaign. We were supporting students right away with that money. Certainly the technological tools, certainly blanketing, and we were very lucky. Miami came together and almost blanketed all of the city of Miami, which is quite large, right? With the internet, but we also opened our buildings, so we never shut down, right? That's part of our spirit, because we recognized that our students were also at home, and mom and dad, if they were working, were on a computer, and their brother and sister were in high school trying to figure out, and 5 people Zooming simultaneously. It's not about bandwidth, it's about quiet space to learn and concentrate and think. And so we had students, we created an entire internal reservation system so students could kind of rent a space when the cafeteria wasn't, and our private dining spaces weren't serving food, they were serving as mini sticky spaces, library spaces. So students could spread out all over campus and have a place to come to campus. We used it for professional development for our faculty and staff to make sure that they could reach our students, and two, so that the teaching tools and the support that students and faculty needed in the new paradigm were as successful as what we knew was happening in the classroom. And so we pivoted around a number of things, including, contact tracing, testing, vaccinations, right? Things specific to the pandemic, and then also things specific to ensuring that our students could strive and to be retained and to be successful. And we've actually seen, I will say, growth in some of our graduate enrollment. And so we're really excited, right? We're optimistic about, we're here, we're going to figure this out, we're going to roll up our sleeves, we'll get the hard work done, but we have to make sure that we don't lose that. The other, which was focused on a core set of for my institution, traditional student affairs, admissions, orientation, onboarding, is recognizing that over the last 2 years, and this year inclusive, right, we're onboarding high school, college freshmen who had high school interrupted. And so that brings on a whole social, academic, cultural set of experiences that we wanted to be able to augment, right? Make the university experience certainly university and not a repeat of high school, but make sure they had those opportunities for engagement, make sure they had those opportunities for the teaching and learning, and set the expectation clearly and effectively of what we wanted of our university freshmen, and how we could onboard them and help them get to where they want to be.
That's great. Well, so much that was done. I know that that just scratches the surface of the kinds of things that you all did, and listening and learning to your students and helping them with what they told you they needed, rather than you just determining for them what was needed. But both of you mentioned the use of some of those federal funds, and we know that those were kind of, well, 1-2 time things. We can't expect that in perpetuity, right? So of the things that you chose to invest in to help be there for your students and help them in that retention and access and continued enrollment, I'll start with you, Elizabeth. Do you anticipate there are things that you are now doing differently at FIU because of this experience, whether or not you have those federal funds, or is this kind of significant investment really contingent upon external funding to make happen?
Yeah, so I'm committed, thrilled that our leadership team is committed. We're not going to let this crisis go to waste. We're learning from it. We're understanding what positive impacts that we've been able to make. We recognize that one, our professional development for our faculty and staff during this situation has really leveraged our ability to be successful. And so we'll continue that. And there's some things that we haven't done in 2 years. And guess what? While it's different and maybe there's some fear in the unknown, no one's missing it. Right. And so that opportunity to reevaluate and reprioritize, I'm comfortable that we're gonna do just fine. Very grateful for the support of the federal government to get our students and our community through this situation. But we're a resilient community, and I know that our students and their families are going to do very well.
Yeah, thanks. I think that expression of what do we need to start doing, stop doing, and keep doing, that like keeps us grounded, right? So I appreciate hearing that in that reevaluation and repositioning, there are things that might have to let go of, and also that you're doubling down on as you're seeing this impact. I know you guys like to track your data very well, but it's also tied to the story. How about you all, Robert? I mean, you talked about hotspots, laptops, all these kinds of spaces and things you've done. Is that something, buying books, is that something that's sustainable, and how are you going to approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something, that's a major goal, is how do we sustain a no cost for textbooks, right? Whether it's through OERs or it's through better negotiations with bookstores. This is not going to go away. This will be the expectation moving forward, that students will not have to pay, or maybe a nominal fee for their textbooks to engage themselves in the classroom. That's going to continue to go. That's been our commitment from day one, and the board, and we're all working together to do that. I think, as Elizabeth mentioned, we are doubling down on professional development for faculty, advisors, and our support staff. And here's the question that I ask of my folks is, it's good to say we did pivot, because we did pivot, and we like to pat ourselves in the back for pivoting very well. But I'm going to ask, are we pivoting with quality, right? Because it's one thing to just say I'm pivoting, and I was able to convert every single course to a remote, but where's the quality component and the aspect of ensuring that the students that are matriculating are prepared for that next course or that next institution? So part of that is professional development. So we've partnered with the ACU, the Association of College University Educators, and that will do specific micro-credentialing for all faculty. And now we're going to create one for dual credit faculty. And we're going to create some for advisors, because we have a case management approach for advising for specific micro-credentialing. So we can say, if we pivot, we're going to pivot with quality. Now, the change of our makeup and how students onboard and the modality of the classes they take and the means by which they engage us in student services will change. We will never go back to pre-COVID conditions, meaning we saw a 100% increase in our students engaging advisors because they were done electronically, online, via chat, via social media, via those avenues. So we can't just throw that away. We need to find a balance between both, right? Because we have some students that still are going to want face-to-face, but some students are going to want to engage their professors and their advisors via social media or other aspects of the way they communicate. So we've got to own the fact that we're not going back to pre-COVID kind of environments. We're going to learn from this, and we're going to change the way we deliver services and do instructions by modality, fast tracking some of those parts of term, embedding micro-credentials into programs so that students, even if they're caught and they're having to stop out, they stop out with a micro-credential and they can still be employable. Here's a disservice that we've done in San Antonio. I'm going to own this. 300,000 students, former students that have stopped out, that have some college, no degree, feel like they have failed because they don't see themselves marketable. Shame on us, because all we've given them is a transcript to be able to hopefully articulate their learning. That's not good enough. So we are scaling up our e-portfolios so that we can assess learning and assess those marketable skills and badge some of those skills, even if they've only taken 15 hours, but they can articulate that learning through an e-portfolio with artifacts to a future employer so they can realize and articulate their value in that organization. We are not going to just let them fend for themselves anymore. We are going to do it for what we should have been doing years ago, because we've been just banking on the fact that they can articulate their learning through a transcript. It's not going to work anymore. So a lot of things are changing, Deborah, and we have to do it better. We have to do it more efficient. We have to give our students and empower our students to articulate that learning to future employers. And it's on us. If not us, then who? You know, you got to do this.
I think that speaks to, thank you both. It speaks to what we know of both of you all in your institutions, which is why we want to have this kind of conversation. It is about that intentionality in serving. You have to know who you're serving, what serves them well. And something that works in another community might not work in yours, but it does take that extra effort rather than assuming you know. And that's been the case time and again with Latino communities, right? Where they assume they know us, there's a profile that's out, media, whatever, and it's often not an accurate one. And if it is, and it's also very deficit based. And, you know, Elizabeth made a very good point, and repeatedly as she does, about talking about the value of the community and Hispanic culture and efforts, right? And leveraging that rather than seeing it as a deficit or something to strip away, right? And Robert, you're talking about that as well, and finding students, even if they take several courses, how do we help them see the value of that? We know with national data, almost the same percentage of Latinos have some college, no degree, as have some degree or higher. And the way of thinking about how we meet students where they're at means that as institutions, we've got to think about, you know, competency-based education, prior learning assessment, as well as some of the things you all are doing with the experiential learning and other strategies and connecting to the workforce. So I'm going to ask you guys to pull out your crystal ball. Not just talking about you at FIU and San Antonio College, which you know are just, we think are exemplars. You're also HSIs that are 60% plus. You've embraced the serving part. I mean, FIU, Elizabeth, you and your team worked hard and have been SEAL certified, have the seal of Excelencia. They can articulate with data and practice and leadership what you're doing with your students. How do you read the kind of information Emily shared about where HSIs are and the drop in Latino enrollment? What do you think we need to be doing at a broader scope, maybe at the national policy level, at the state policy level, to get to some of the kind of efforts and successes that you found for your community in a broader context? And I'll start with you, Elizabeth.
Certainly. So, you know, we're all amongst friends, and I think that we can talk about Hispanic enrollment, but it's really about Hispanic success, right? And so that's the differentiator. And the Seal of Excelencia, you know, worked very hard to develop parameters around that. And I think as we see some of these emerging HSIs come on board, it may be through job opportunities, through demographic shifts in business and industry. We've seen that already in the pandemic. But those institutions have a responsibility to respond to their communities. And I'll say this, faculty and students alike, what the pandemic and how the pandemic has impacted them is they're more informed consumers. Both faculty and students don't want to sit in a classroom and do the passive receptive stuff. So I think there's going to be a rise in professional development because there's going to be a rise in active learning, in improved teaching, improved learning, improved outcomes, because students can then, otherwise they can just Zoom it, right? They can Zoom it if they don't want to engage. and faculty, we've seen it, Robert mentioned it, and we've seen it as well. Students are not missing academic advising appointments because they're virtual. Telehealth, mental counseling, there's an improved yield there. And so there's some things that the university has always done that, as we said, we'll reprioritize and shift and do in different ways. But I do think that it is time for us at a policy level to recognize those institutions who are completing with their obligation to serve their students, and that service might be measured in multiple ways. As Robert said, we have micro credentials too. We're upskilling and reskilling every community if we're working through industry with industry as partners, because everyone is doing that. Right. So none of us, when we went to school, I'm putting Robert and Deborah and I in the same category, we didn't have conversations about the impacts of AI. But we now are having that in our own fields. And so what does that look like? So I'm very proud if I can go and upskill, and that education, I think, is critically important to our community broadly. So I certainly want to see the continuum, if you will, of a seal of Excelencia, of institutions who serve their students well, with intentionality, with outcomes, and that the outcomes are what is commended and rewarded in our educational community.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. I think a lot there for continued action. You don't stop and wait for others. You guys have taken that lead and sharing some of those ideas, super helpful. Robert, from your perspective, what are the kinds of things that learning from what you've done and think about going forward that funders or policymakers, others need to be thinking about to support and sustain this?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a couple of things. Elizabeth had some really good ones there. I'm just thinking we need to stop using an antiquated system by which we help students articulate their learning or their success, right? A transcript and a credit hour or 3 credit hours, what does that mean to an employer? An employer wants you to articulate the value that you bring to their organization as an employee, right? So we need to figure that out and stop doing things the way we've always done them as higher ed institutions and expect that students are going to be able to do that for themselves. That's something that needs to be, we've got to address that at a national level. Second, I think it's how we assess institutions regarding success for Latinos, right? Let's say, for a lot of us, we treat careers as like destinations. Like there's only one destination, right? And we all know better than that. We know that in our lifetime, we take twists and turns and curves and things that happen, and you adjust. And so why aren't we doing a better job creating a system by which we can reward those milestones on their way to their destination that may or may not change, but we don't do a good job of that. We say, well, where do you want to be? Well, I want to be a lawyer. That's great. Let's get you in political science, right? Without even asking the student, well, where are you? Tell me a little bit about your home life. Well, we don't have enough money for sometimes to eat. Or have you thought about maybe getting a paralegal certificate on your way to become an attorney, right? That we can at least get you out of that situation. And then maybe these law firms will actually pay for your college, right? So we do a really poor job from high school to college, really articulating what that journey means. We need to stop treating careers as destinations. We need to treat them as, what they are. And they're really, it's a journey filled with milestones and accomplishments, short-term, long-term, to get where you want to get. And I don't think we're upfront with our students about things like that.
I'm also hearing correct me wrong, and that I know we probably have some questions that Cassandra can ask us as well from those who've been listening. But Robert, I'm hearing some of the focus on the potential, like we're calling scaffolding in public policy, right? How do you scaffold and go from being a home health care aide to a phlebotomist, and a phlebotomist to the potential of an RN? And each point along the way, it's adding value and increasing salary, but also value add. So is that what I'm hearing? Okay.
That's exactly.
Now we have to evaluate each step along the way rather than saying you're one or not. Okay.
Right. That's
Okay.
exactly right. Because that's a framework. That's a framework. We're bound to our lanes,
Right.
and our students don't. We know that's not the way life works. And let's start being open and honest with our students and explaining that they're not a failure. If you stop out for one semester because you got to take care of your mom who is battling a serious illness, right? There's no failure in that. You're actually doing what any family member would do for their loved one.
Right.
But we treat them and chalk them up as, well, you're stopping out. Stop out is deficit. You're not stopping out. You're
Right.
helping your mom. There's no deficit to that. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
The challenge comes in then, with the data perspective, how do you track that well? Because those are not measures that we
Right.
value, unfortunately. We
Right.
should.
Right.
And I think that's part of both of your point, right? Because it's not just that. We need to be clear. I think to Elizabeth's point, I heard outcomes matter. It does matter if people are successful. That success might be defined multiple ways. There's some ways it has been defined, but if you can get a couple classes and get an increase in your hourly wage, is that not success? But it's not a degree. How do we capture that? Okay, you've given us a lot to stew on. This doesn't even solve, I think it just scratches the surface of how we need to be thinking more robustly about this. So thank you for raising that. I want to just give a moment or two. Cassandra, I haven't been paying attention to chats or questions. Are there questions for Elizabeth or Robert that we need to raise before we end our time together and think about the next discussion?
Yeah, so there is a question in the chat here where the individual is providing a context that their institution has received a high number of applications, but a low number of students accepting their admissions offers. So they're wondering for both our panelists, what types of yield efforts do you have in place, or are you thinking about to enroll fall 2022 applicants? So what are you looking forward in the future to kind of secure that yield?
Thanks, Cassandra. Either one of you, I know some of you have open admissions and others not, but Elizabeth, maybe I'll start with you.
Certainly. So we're certainly following the data as Deborah will tell you very closely. Our point in time comparisons for fall 2022 are optimistic. So we're ahead of where we were last year with admissions and matriculation, which is how we measure the intent to enroll and reservations for orientation. But we actually we were nimble and we changed our communication efforts. And so once those admissions offers went out to the portal, to how we manage and message with our students, we redoubled other communications efforts to ensure that the intentionality of enrolling didn't get lost in so many other priorities that are happening in our community. So we were very thoughtful about how we would communicate this year to make sure that students kept fall 2022 on the horizon as the place to be at FIU.
Interesting. Thanks. Robert, I know you're open access, but how have you been approaching your enrollment strategy for 22?
No, that's great. One of the things that, our students may start an application, but maybe not finish an application. So we say, well, if they finish, they're ready. No. So we've done is double down on enrollment coaches to start. The moment they access the application, they are being case managed, which means because they've shown an intent. So somewhere, somehow, maybe at 2 a.m, they said, man, I think I really want to go to college. And they get inspired, they get into the application and they're like, oh my gosh, I can't do this. And they exit. No. We need to go talk to that individual. We need to figure out because they've shown interest, right? So we need to take more accountability. And I love what Elizabeth said, intentionality about they made the effort. We can just say, well, they didn't get here. No, we got to go get them. We got to go figure out why they started it and let's help them finish it to get them here. So it's a case management approach from the moment they start the application all the way through graduation.
Okay. Thank you. I know there are other questions. Cassandra, thank you for raising that though. We are at time. Time goes fast when you're having good conversations, learning about wonderful things institutions are doing that are trying to be proactive and intentional serving students. Thank you both, Elizabeth, Robert. Thank you, Emily, for sharing the research and work we're doing. This is important work we know we need to keep doing, informing the field with a Latino lens to make sure our community amongst all are served and served well. So thank you all for what you're doing to make that happen. Look forward to our continued conversations as we try to change the field to be more student-centered. Thank you all. Really appreciate it. Have a good evening. Bye.
You.